This is going to be somewhat longer than normal introduction, just because there's some interesting parallels that Nick and I have had, unbeknownst to either of us, and even sort of putting together this introduction, I found a nice little gem that was also a parallel. So going with this non-traditional introduction, let me start out by saying that my first whiff of his work came from a friend, another Carr, Dan Carr, who's back there, and he's on the board of directors of the Maine Island Trail Association, which promotes the use and conservancy of islands off the coast of Maine and does a lot of kayaking. So he met with me here at Harvard Square, and we were talking about this and that, and I was talking about how I got intensely interested in navigation using natural clues, and what this did was it gave me a heightened sense of my surroundings. And after about a year of doing this, this was about the time when cell phones became big, and so all of a sudden everybody's wandering around, walking across the street doing this sort of thing. And I became very fearful for their lives, and I almost wanted to shake them and tell them that you're going to die if you do that. And I realized that wouldn't be terribly polite, so I started a course in sort of reconnecting with the natural world. So I was telling Dan this, and he said, "Oh, you have to read this book, The Shallows, by Nick Carr." And it's like, and it was like, okay. So he sent me his personal copy, and I read it, and indeed it's a fantastic book, and also was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Now, he has this most recent book, The Glass Cage, which I'm quite happy to say that even mentions some of my work in there, so that was kind of nice. And I had an email exchange with Nick about that, so there's another little parallel going on, and we met up at the Boston Book Festival too, so there's yet another parallel going on. Then I started to put together this introduction, and then I read that he wrote this book called The Big Switch, which came out in 2008. So let me say something about that. When I work at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, at CERN, and have been engaged in that since about 1995. And at a certain point, I had the misfortune to be promoted to the position of U.S. Atlas Computing and Physics Director, basically. And the problem was we didn't have any funding for computing, and we were told to go out and figure out a way to get funding for computing. So we were told we had to come up with a big idea and something that was sellable to the funding agencies and the politicians and that sort of thing. So we hooked up with some computer scientists who had just invented something called grid computing, which sounded real snazzy. And the idea behind grid computing is, well, if you have a toaster, you plug it into the socket and power comes out. And so the idea was that computing could basically be ubiquitous, but the problem was that nobody had really realized this idea or put it together. So the plan was that we would take our physics application, which was this big, huge experiment with all these people needing data, and basically gridify it and take some of the software that the computer scientists had developed and then really battle test it. And so somewhere along the line, somebody came up with this great idea for cloud computing. And then all of a sudden, Microsoft and Apple were interested in cloud computing and picked it up and that sort of thing. So when I was researching this, I saw The Big Switch and then realized that he'd been writing about how cloud computing is changing the way one looks at computing and how it's sort of become a commodity. And so this was the whole basically elevator speech I'd been giving to politicians back in the late 1990s. So there's yet another parallel. So I'm going to sort of end on a weird note here, and Paul, you'll have to forgive me for this, but so one of the current themes that Nick writes about is the effect of the internet, availability of computing and technology on how humans think. And I completely buy into this, by the way, and the ways it happens are fascinating, so I'll just give you a quick anecdote. Last year in the spring, when I was teaching my course on primitive navigation, there were tons of people that had laptops open. And in fact, we also videotaped the lectures, and the attendance dwindled dramatically because they could go back and look on the internet at the lectures, but they didn't retain any material because they were basically multitasking while they were watching the lectures. But then there was this defining moment. I wanted to do a little lecture and demonstration on bioluminescence. So I had a flask full of an organism called dinoflagellates, and these emit light when they're subjected to a pressure wave. So I grew these very carefully in my basement, believe it or not, and had a little black felt over top of it while I was lecturing. And I wanted to then turn down all the lights and swish this around so they could see the light from the dinoflagellates and the bioluminescence. So I turned down all the lights, but it was still bright. I didn't know why. And then I realized that there was light coming from the laptop shining off the faces of the students. So I said, okay, can you please turn off your laptops? But the laptops weren't getting turned off. And the problem was they couldn't hear me tell them to turn off their laptops. Okay, so that was how engaged they were in the lecture. They were, it turns out, some of the people in the back who were sort of confederates of mine were telling me that they were buying shoes online and doing Facebook and this sort of thing. They most certainly were not taking notes. So finally they had to turn off their laptop. So one of the standard things we ask people to do in these talks, these lectures, is to turn off your cell phones and close your laptops as a matter of courtesy to the speaker, and so you can retain information better. So I'm going to ask you to close your laptops. Thank you, and here's Nick.
Thanks very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. And my thanks to the Radcliffe Institute for giving me the honor of inviting me to participate in the lecture series this year. I owe John a particular thanks because his book, The Lost Art of Finding Our Way, came out in 2013. I hope that's right? While I was working on the book that became The Glass Cage. And The Glass Cage is about how, when we hand off more and more of our activities and our judgments to computers and to software, how that influences our own ability to act and to make judgments. And I knew from the start that I wanted to deal with the subject of navigation in some way, and because it was clear that this was a great example in people's everyday lives where you become more and more reliant on the computer to get around, and what does that do to our own navigational sense? And John's book was very much both illuminating to me and an inspiration to me, and so thank you for that. I should also mention that in the book, The Big Switch, I actually talk, you probably don't know this, I use CERN as an example of the grid computing, so it's even more entwined than that. And so what I'd like to talk about today draws on and builds on the work that I did for The Glass Cage. About 2,000 miles north of here, that is north, right? About 2,000 miles north of here is a small Arctic island named Igloolik. It sits just off the coast of the Melville Peninsula in what's called the Nunavut territory of the Canadian North. And in the winter, Igloolik is an extraordinarily inhospitable place. Now, I'm sure that you guys, having been through the winter you've been through, don't want to hear about how bad it is for other people, but I can tell you Igloolik is in a league of its own. The temperature throughout the winter hovers around 20 degrees below zero. Thick sheets of sea ice cover everything, cover the surrounding waters, and the sun is absent. But despite those brutal conditions, Inuit hunters have, for an estimated 4,000 years, ventured out from their homes on the island and traversed miles of ice and tundra in search of caribou and other game. The hunters' ability to navigate this incredibly barren and frozen terrain where landmarks are few, paths are covered up by new snow every night, and snow formations are in constant flux, has amazed voyagers and scientists ever since 1822, which is when the English explorer William Edward Parry, on his second attempt to find a Northwest Passage, went by Igloolik, and in his journal he mentions quote, the astonishing precision of his Inuit guide's geographic knowledge of the area. Now, the Inuits' wayfinding skills aren't born of technological prowess. They've largely eschewed maps and compasses and other instruments, but rather of a profound understanding of winds, snowdrift patterns, animal behavior, stars, currents, and other features of the natural world. The Inuit, in other words, are masters of perception, or at least they used to be. Something changed in their culture around the turn of the millennium. In the year 2000, if you remember, the United States government deregulated and opened up and lifted many of the restrictions on the civilian use of the global positioning satellite system. And so the accuracy of GPS devices sharpened enormously, even as the price of those devices plunged. In the Aglulik hunters, who had long ago traded their dog sleds for snowmobiles, they very quickly began to buy GPS devices and began to rely on the satellites in the digital maps in place of their own native skills for navigation. The younger Inuit, as you might imagine, were especially eager to use this new technology. In the past, a young hunter had to go through years and years of an apprenticeship with his elders in order to develop those very fine navigational skills. By just going out and buying a cheap GPS receiver, you could suddenly skip all the training and offload responsibility for navigation to the device. And he could travel out in some conditions like dense fog that used to make it impossible to go out hunting. The ease, convenience, and precision of the automated navigation aids made the Inuits' traditional navigational sense and techniques seem antiquated and cumbersome by comparison. But something interesting happened as GPS devices came into common use on Aglulik. Reports began to spread of serious accidents while people were out on hunts, including some that led to serious injuries and even deaths. And this was something that never used to happen when the hunters relied on their own navigational sense. And ultimately, the cause of many of the accidents was traced to an over-reliance on the satellites in digital navigation. When a GPS receiver breaks or its batteries freeze, a hunter who is out on a hunt and hasn't developed strong wayfinding skills can easily become lost in the featureless waste and fall victim to exposure. And even when the devices operate properly, they present hazards. The routes so meticulously plotted on satellite maps can give hunters a form of tunnel vision. Trusting the GPS instructions, they'll speed out onto dangerously thin ice, go over cliffs, or go into other environmental perils that a skilled navigator would have had the sense and foresight to avoid. The anthropologist Claudio Aporta of Carleton University in Ottawa has been studying Inuit hunters for years. And he reports that while satellite navigation has no doubt brought important and attractive advantages, its adoption has already brought a deterioration in wayfinding abilities and more generally a weakened feel for the land. As a hunter on a GPS-equipped snowmobile devotes his attention to the instructions coming from the computer, he loses sight of his surroundings. He travels blindfolded, as Aporta puts it. So a singular talent that has defined and distinguished a people for thousands of years may well evaporate over the course of just a generation or two. The world is a strange, changeable, and dangerous place. Getting around in it demands of any animal a great deal of effort, mental as well as physical. For ages, we human beings have been creating tools to reduce the strain of travel. History, you could argue, is, among other things, a record of the discovery of ingenious new ways to ease our passage through our environs, to make it possible to cross greater and ever more daunting distances without getting lost, roughed up, or eaten. Simple maps and trail markers came first, then star maps and nautical charts and terrestrial globes, and later instruments like sounding weights, quadrants, astrolabes, compasses, octants, sextants, chronometers. Lighthouses were erected along shorelines, buoys set in coastal waters. Roads were paved, signs posted, highways linked and numbered. For most of us, it's been a long time since we've had to rely on our wits to get around. GPS receivers and other automated mapping and direction plotting devices, I would argue, are the latest additions to our navigational toolkit. But they also give the old story a new and worrisome twist. Earlier navigational aids were just that, aids. They were designed to give travelers a greater awareness of the world around them, to sharpen our sense of direction, provide us with advance warning of danger, highlight nearby landmarks and other points of orientation, and in general help us situate ourselves in both familiar and alien settings. Satellite navigation systems can do all those things and more, but they're not designed to deepen our involvement with our surroundings. They're designed to relieve us of the need for such involvement. By taking control of the mechanics of navigation and reducing our own role to following routine commands, turn left in 500 yards, take the next exit, stay right, destination ahead. The systems, whether running through a dashboard, a smartphone, or a dedicated GPS receiver, end up isolating us from the environment. As a team of Cornell researchers wrote in a 2008 paper, with the GPS, you no longer need to know where you are and where your destination is, attend to physical landmarks along the way, or get assistance from other people. The automation of wayfinding serves to, as they wrote, inhibit the process of experiencing the physical world by navigation through it. As is so often the case with gadgets and services that ease our way through our lives, we've celebrated the arrival of inexpensive GPS units. The New York Times writer David Brooks spoke for many of us, I think, when in a 2007 column titled "The Outsourced Brain," he raved about the navigation system installed in his new car. "I quickly established a romantic attachment to my GPS," he wrote. "I felt warm and safe following her thin blue line." His GPS goddess, as he described it, had liberated him from the age-old drudgery of navigation. And yet, he grudgingly confessed, the emancipation delivered by his in-dash muse came at a cost. After a few weeks, it occurred to me that I could no longer get anywhere without her. Any trip slightly out of the ordinary had me typing the address into her system and then blissfully following her satellite-fed commands. I found that I was quickly shedding all vestiges of geographic knowledge. The price of convenience was, Brooks wrote, a loss of autonomy. The goddess was also a siren. Now, we want to see computer maps as being interactive, high-tech versions of paper maps, but I think that's a mistaken assumption. Traditional maps give us context. They provide us with an overview of an area and require us to figure out our current location and then plan or visualize the best route to our next stop. That mental effort, it turns out, aids our mind in creating its own cognitive map of an area. Map reading, research shows, strengthens our sense of place and hones our navigational skill in ways that can make it easier for us to get around even when we don't have a map at hand. We seem, without knowing it, to call on our subconscious memories of paper maps in orienting ourselves in a city or town, in determining which way to head to arrive at our destination. In one revealing experiment, researchers found that people's navigational sense is actually sharpest when they're facing north, the same way maps point. Paper maps don't just shepherd us from one place to the next, they teach us how to think about space. The maps generated by satellite-linked computers are very different. They usually provide meager spatial information and few navigational cues. Instead of requiring us to puzzle out where we are in an area, a GPS device simply sets us at the center of the map and then makes the world circulate around us. in this miniature parody of a pre-Copernican universe. We can get around without needing to know where we are, where we've been, or which direction we're heading. We just need an address or an intersection, the name of a building or a shop, to cue the device's calculations. Julia Frankenstein, a German cognitive psychologist who studies the mind's navigational sense, believes it's likely that, as she writes, the more we rely on technology to find our way, the less we build our own cognitive maps. Because computer navigation systems provide only bare bones route information without the spatial context of the whole area, she explains, our brains don't receive the raw material required to form rich memories of a place. Developing a cognitive map from this reduced information, she says, is a bit like trying to get an entire musical piece from a few notes. Other scientists agree. A British study found that drivers using paper maps developed stronger memories of routes and landmarks than did those relying on turn-by-turn instructions from satellite systems. After completing a trip, the map users were able to sketch more precise and detailed diagrams of their routes. The findings, reported the researchers, provide strong evidence that the use of a vehicle navigation system will impact negatively on the formation of drivers' cognitive maps. A study of drivers conducted at the University of Utah found evidence of what the researchers called inattentional blindness in GPS users, which impaired their wayfinding performance and their ability to form visual memories of their surroundings. GPS-wielding pedestrians appear to suffer the same disabilities. In an experiment conducted in Japan, researchers had a group of people walk to a series of destinations in a city. Some of the subjects were given handheld GPS devices, others used paper maps. The ones with the maps took more direct routes, had to pause less often to figure out where they were, and formed clearer memories of where they'd been than did the ones with the gadgets. An artist and designer named Sarah Hendren recently wrote an article about how easy it is to become dependent on computer maps today, and how such dependency can short-circuit the mind's navigational sense. While attending a meeting in an unfamiliar city, she came to realize that, as she wrote, I was using my phone's map application with spoken cues to make the same short trip between my hotel and a conference center just 5 minutes away, several days in a row. I was really just willfully turning off the sphere of perception that I've relied on heavily most of my life. I made no attempt to remember landmarks and relationships and the look and feel of roads and such. She worried that by outsourcing multimodal responsiveness and memory, she is, as she put it, impoverishing my overall sensory experience. We know that a loss of navigational acumen can be fatal for pilots and truck drivers and sailors and hikers. But most of us, let's face it, in our daily routines of driving and walking and otherwise getting around, are unlikely to find ourselves in particularly perilous situations, or much less in mortal peril, which raises the obvious question, who cares? As long as we arrive at our destination, does it really matter whether we maintain our own navigational sense or offload it to a machine? Inuit elder on Igloolik may have good reason to bemoan the adoption of GPS technology as a cultural tragedy, and some of them do, but those of us living in lands crisscrossed by well-marked roads and furnished with gas stations, motels, and 7-Elevens long ago lost both the custom of and the capacity for prodigious feats of wayfinding. Our ability to perceive and interpret topography, especially in its natural state, is already much reduced. Paring it away further or dispensing with it altogether doesn't seem like such a big deal, particularly if, in exchange, we get an easier go of it. But while we may no longer have much of a cultural stake in the conservation of our navigational prowess, we still have a personal stake in it. We are, after all, creatures of the earth. We're not abstract dots proceeding along thin blue lines on computer screens. We're real beings in real bodies, in real places. Getting to know a place takes effort, but it ends in fulfillment and in knowledge. It provides a sense of personal accomplishment and autonomy, and it provides a sense of belonging, a feeling of being at home in a place rather than passing through it. Whether practiced by a caribou hunter on an ice floe or a bargain hunter on an urban street, wayfinding opens a path from alienation to attachment. We may grimace when we hear people talk of finding themselves, but the figure of speech, however vain and shop-worn it may be, acknowledges our deeply held sense that who we are is tangled up in where we are. We can't extract the self from its surroundings, at least not without leaving something important behind. A GPS device, by allowing us to get from point A to point B with the least possible effort and nuisance, can make our lives easier, perhaps imbuing us, as David Brooks suggests, with a numb sort of bliss. But what it steals from us when we turn to it too often, at least, is the joy and satisfaction of apprehending the world around us and of making that world a part of us. In his book, Being Alive, Tim Ingold, an anthropologist at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, draws a distinction between two very different modes of travel, which he refers to as wayfaring and transport. Wayfaring, he says, is our most fundamental way of being in the world. Immersed in the landscape, attuned to its textures and features, the wayfarer enjoys an experience of movement in which action and perception are intimately coupled. Wayfaring becomes, Ingold writes, an ongoing process of growth and development or self-renewal. Transport, on the other hand, is essentially destination-oriented. It's not so much a process of discovery along a way of life as a mere carrying across from location to location of people and goods in such a way as to leave their basic natures unaffected. In transport, the traveler doesn't actually move in any meaningful way. Rather, he is moved, becoming a passenger in his own body. He becomes, you might say, a piece of cargo. Wayfaring is, of course, messier and less efficient than transport, and that's exactly why it has become a target for computer automation. If you have a mobile phone with Google Maps, says Michael Jones, an executive in Google's mapping division, you can go anywhere on the planet and have confidence that we can give you directions to get where you want to go safely and easily. As a result, he declares, no human ever has to feel lost again. Now, that certainly sounds appealing, as if some basic problem in our existence had been solved forever, and it fits the Silicon Valley ideology and obsession with using software to rid people's lives of friction. But the more you think about it, the more you realize that to never confront the possibility of getting lost is to live in a state of perpetual dislocation. If you never have to worry about not knowing where you are, then you never have to know where you are. Beyond sacrificing a sense of place, we may lose other things as we let our wayfinding skills wither. Deeper things, very important things. Neuroscientists have in recent decades made a series of breakthroughs in understanding how the brain perceives and remembers space and location. And the discoveries underscore the elemental role that navigation seems to play in the workings of mind and memory. In a landmark study conducted at University College London in the early 1970s, John O'Keefe monitored the brains of lab rats as the rodents moved about an enclosed area. As a rat became familiar with the space, individual neurons in its hippocampus, a part of the brain that plays a central role in memory formation, would begin to fire every time the animal passed a certain spot. These location-keyed neurons, which O'Keefe dubbed place cells, and which have since been found in the brains of other mammals, including our own brains, can be thought of as the signposts the brain uses to mark out a territory. Every time you enter a new place, whether a city square or the kitchen of a neighbor's house, the area is quickly mapped out with place cells in your brain. The cells, as O'Keefe has explained, appear to be activated by a variety of sensory signals, including visual, auditory, and tactile cues, each of which, he writes, can be perceived when the animal is in a particular part of the environment. More recently, in 2005, a team of Norwegian neuroscientists, led by the couple Edvard and May-Britt Moser, discovered a different set of neurons involved in charting, measuring, and navigating space, which they named grid cells. Located in a region closely related to the hippocampus, the cells create in the brain a precise geographic grid of space consisting of an array of regularly spaced equilateral triangles. The Mosers compare the grid to a sheet of graph paper in the mind on which an animal's location is traced as it moves about. Whereas place cells map out specific locations, grid cells provide a more abstract map of space that remains the same wherever an animal goes, providing an inner sense of dead reckoning. Working in tandem and drawing on signals from other neurons that monitor bodily direction and motion, place and grid cells act, in the words of the science writer James Gorman, as a kind of built-in navigation system that is at the very heart of how animals know where they are going, and where they have been. In addition to their role in navigation, the specialized cells appear to be involved more generally in the formation of memories, particularly memories of events and experiences. In fact, O'Keefe and the Mosers, as well as other scientists, have begun to theorize that the mental travel of memory is governed by the same brain systems that enable us to get around in the world. In a 2013 article in Nature Neuroscience, Edvard Moser provided extensive experimental evidence that, as he put it, the neuronal mechanisms that evolved to define the spatial relationship among landmarks can also serve to embody associations among objects, events, and other types of factual information. Out of such associations, we weave the memories of our lives. It may well be that the brain's navigational sense, its ancient, intricate way of plotting and recording movement through space, is the evolutionary font of all memory. What's more than a little scary is what happens when that font goes dry. Our spatial sense tends to deteriorate as we get older, and in the worst cases, we lose it altogether. One of the earliest and most debilitating symptoms of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, is hippocampal degeneration and the consequent loss of locational memory. Victims begin to forget where they are. Veronique Bobo, a research psychiatrist and memory expert at McGill University in Montreal, has done extensive research demonstrating that the way people exercise their navigational skills influences the functioning and even the size of their hippocampus and may provide protection against the deterioration of memory. The harder people work at building their own cognitive maps of space, the stronger their underlying memory circuits seem to become. They appear to actually grow gray matter in the hippocampus, a phenomenon famously documented in London cab drivers, in a way that's analogous to the building of muscle mass through physical exertion. But when they simply follow turn-by-turn instructions in what Bobo calls a robotic fashion, they don't stimulate their hippocampus, and as a result may leave themselves more susceptible to memory loss. She worries that should the hippocampus begin to atrophy from a lack of use in navigation, the result could be a general loss of memory and a growing risk of dementia. Society, she writes, is geared in many ways towards shrinking the hippocampus. In the next 20 years, I think we're going to see dementia occurring earlier and earlier. Bobo and other scholars emphasize that more research needs to be done before we'll know for sure whether long-term use of GPS devices weakens memory and raises the risk of senility. But as we learn more about the close links and interconnections between navigation, the hippocampus, and memory, it seems entirely plausible that avoiding the work of figuring out where we are and where we're going may have unforeseen and less than salubrious consequences. Because memory is what enables us not only to recall past events, but also to respond intelligently to present events and plan for future ones, any degradation in its functioning would tend to diminish the quality of our lives. Last year, John O'Keefe and the Mosers were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for their groundbreaking research into our navigational sense. I don't know if you followed the news about the prize, but if you did, you'll recall that the press invariably described the scientists as having discovered the brain's GPS system. We're so enamored of and dependent on our contemporary digital technologies that we rush to use them as metaphors to describe ourselves to ourselves. But what goes on inside our minds and bodies when we move through the world is nothing at all like a GPS system. There are no signals being beamed into us from satellites orbiting the planet, at least not yet. We are, and I want to emphasize this point again, creatures of the earth. Through hundreds of thousands of years, evolution has fit our bodies and minds to the environment. We've been formed by being, to steal a couple of lines from the poet Wordsworth, rolled round in Earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. The automation of wayfinding distances us from the environment that shaped us. It encourages us to observe and manipulate symbols on screens rather than attend to real things in real places. The world, in turn, is made less meaningful. As we adapt to our streamlined digital environment, we render ourselves incapable of perceiving what the world offers its most ardent inhabitants. Like the young, satellite-guided Inuit hunter, we travel blindfolded. The labors our obliging digital deities would have us see as mere drudgery may turn out to be vital to our fitness, happiness, and well-being. So, who cares? Probably isn't the right question. What we should be asking ourselves is this: how far from the world do we want to retreat? Thank you.
So we have time for questions. I don't know if you want to field them or I will, but in the back there?
I take issue with something that you said. I think it's a matter of discipline or conscious decision. I had the pleasure of helping some of my friends who were PhD students at the Media Lab in personal robotics, and they wanted me to test artificial intelligence, a way to navigate how to drive around Boston, which is rather inhospitable. And it would automatically say, like, you're running low on gas, here are immediately the 3 stations you need. Or it would adjust the time, you say estimated time to go to a meeting or appointment, and if it started raining or snowing, it would adjust it accordingly, so you could, sort of let people know that you would be late. You was hands-free, so that if you were on, if somebody rang it, you could automatically send a text like, I'm driving now, don't call me. So it was actually a very useful thing. However, I think about when I'm driving in a city I'm not familiar with, or like an inhospitable place like Boston, that's very useful. But at the same time, the best times I've had is when I got lost on my way to Montreal in Vermont, and I had pancakes with maple syrup in a family-owned restaurant, and I had no idea where I was. Or just going for a drive, for the mere pleasure of going for a drive. I'm the same person, but yet still I can compartmentalize the utility of immediate function. I need to be somewhere for work versus vacation for pleasure. Why? So you can keep some of your brain cells as opposed to over-reliance and always doing it and then sort of destroying your love or the pleasure of just discovery.
Yeah, I completely agree that what we need is discipline in how we use these tools. I'm not arguing that GPS system isn't useful at all. I actually got lost in Providence, near Providence, yesterday, and thankfully had a phone that had Google Maps on it and found my way back. So I think the judicious use of these tools can be very valuable. But what we see, I think, and you can just look at people as they go about their lives, what we see is very, very quickly, people in general become reliant and dependent on it. And instead of thinking carefully about, should I use this or not, they simply take the path of least resistance and turn it on. And so, one of my hopes is that I can encourage people to think in the terms you're thinking of, that let's use this when it has a particular function, but not simply turn to it or to any automated system as a way, simply out of a belief that ease and convenience are always better than working a little harder at something.
Or an addiction.
Yeah.
We're here.
I have a lot of sympathy for this view, and that I've been exploring Boston Harbor for years and never with GPS, and I'm proud of how I can find my way around Boston Harbor. But in the last 6 months, I've discovered Waze. And Waze, for driving, from the suburbs in here, Waze actually has a dimension that I never had before, the time dimension. It knows where traffic is bad. It's taken me many places that many routes I've never been before. My normal commute for 20 years was, I knew exactly where I was going and paid a lot of attention to it to go to home. Now, Waze is many times taking me to interesting new places on the way home. And so I'm not so sure that the GPS is always such a bad thing.
Want to comment or?
But I mean, my comment would be similar, that I can certainly understand that, in that a lot of this comes down to how these systems are designed, both how they're used and how they're designed. And, again, I would say, used judiciously, they can be quite valuable. But what we see, and this is backed up by, Google's statements about this desire to put us into a world where every move we make can be plotted for the greatest efficiency or whatever, in this feeling that we'll be better off if we have no friction in our lives. Whereas what we know is that friction, actually overcoming friction, is what provides satisfaction and fulfillment. So again, I would say that I'm not arguing that the tool has no place. I'm arguing that we have to think carefully about what its proper place should be.
Two questions here and then back. So for Hugh, and then I'm trying to keep track of the order in which people raise their hands. So yeah.
So I've been thinking about what you're talking about now, and also with reference to stuff you wrote about in Shallows about because the way society is changing and adopting these technologies to become kind of the expected baseline of what everyone ought to be doing, I feel frequently that I don't have as much choice about when I can be opting out of some of these technological impositions, whereas somebody with a little bit more station or socioeconomic status might be able to have the luxury of writing longhand or taking their time or not, going to the library instead of
Or getting lost.
Yeah. So do you have any advice or suggestions about how somebody a little bit lower in the social totem pole can find some refuge from this stuff?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. It's getting harder and harder to do, because I think this is not unusual for technologies. As they get embraced by society, they start to be woven into society's expectations, society's processes, and then it becomes harder and harder to say, this isn't right for me, because at your job, you're expected to be constantly monitoring messages. In your social life, all your friends are planning what they're going to do and exchanging comments and information online. And so, I'm not going. It's hard for me to be too encouraging, unfortunately, because I know the pressures that are building. And as I say, we've seen it before. We saw it with automobiles and stuff. Society kind of reshapes itself around the technology, and then to opt out of the technology is to kind of opt out of society. And most people don't want to do that or can't afford to do that. So I think, I think the there's two kind of solutions. One is to do what you can to resist the drift of society in that direction, and that's a hard thing to do, but I think it's an important thing. And the second is that to make sure you keep exercising the possibilities of your mind that aren't fulfilled or encouraged by the technology. So I think our computers and our smartphones, for all their benefits, have been designed to be kind of interruption machines and distraction machines. And so to counter that, I think it means that in your personal life, you have to set aside significant amounts of time undistracted and uninterrupted by the technology and engaging in attentive forms of thought. And similarly, when you're driving or when you're getting around or walking around, only in situations when you don't know where you are and you're really lost should you turn on the navigational system. Otherwise, you should spend a little extra time to build that understanding of place. So I think it is possible in people's personal lives to kind of resist to some degree the overwhelming pressure to look to the computer to help you do everything in other spheres of life, work life, school life, social life. It's becoming harder and harder to opt out without all sorts of consequences.
Okay, this woman next to you.
Yeah, I'm interested in when you talked about how use of GPS, for example, alters our relationship with things and places and the corresponding changes in the brain. And it occurs to me that we're a social species, and a lot of our brain is taken up with keeping track of our place in society and our interaction with other people. And just as we may be losing an ability to be wayfinders, I'm curious whether you see any loss of ability to be skilled readers of social, of emotion, of those things which we're a social species,
Yeah.
are important to us as a species.
I think the concern is a valid one. I wouldn't profess to be an expert on that, but I've followed some of the research, and I think the research isn't solid enough yet to come to a conclusion about whether we're kind of deadening some of our subtle social skills, our ability to read other people. But there is some research into empathy and things like that seems to indicate that tends to happen when you're not attentively involved with other people in a face-to-face kind of communication. And it used to be, the debate was, is face-to-face communication better than online communication? To me, that debate is kind of over, because even when we're talking to each other one-on-one, face-to-face, often there's technology involved. The person you're talking to will pull out their phone because they got a message, or you can see in their eyes that they're really thinking they'd rather be looking at their phone than listening to you. Maybe that's just me. But I do think that is a concern, because we live at a time that we're so dependent on screens and technologies and software that what I think we're beginning to find is that we underestimate the qualities of life and the aspects of life that can't be turned into software. The physical nature of life and that kind of subtle perception of each other, we take that so much for granted that we can give it away without even figuring out we're giving it away. And just to attach that to driving, I was recently reading an interesting study about how even when you're driving, how important it is to read other people. And in fact, a lot of driving is about anticipating what people are going to do, making brief eye contact. Sometimes that's not advised, but particularly in Boston. But in a worry about the world we're entering, where there's going to be a lot of highly automated vehicles, but a lot of old vehicles too that aren't automated at all, is that a lot of people are going to continue to look for signals, human signals from other drivers, and it's going to be a robot driving the car, and things might actually become, that might increase the risks in driving, because you can't anticipate what a robot is going to do the way you anticipate what a person is going to do. So I think that aspect of social relations is something we underestimate, but is important in all sorts of areas.
So the gentleman back there.
So I was kind of, I thought that your speech kind of articulated a particular process, more or less that you, at least when you're sort of, when you're sort of trying to like present information to a user, right? The first step would be sort of just kind of giving them an information dump. And the second thing that you might want to do is to give them some like conclusions. So in the case of GPS, you could give people like a map, or you could give them, like they can ask you what question they actually want to get answered, like how do I get from here to there? And you could sort of just give them that solution. So I kind of think that that's sort of where, pretty much all of our sort of data processing capacity is going to go towards sort of presenting conclusions to people. And so I think that you kind of articulated the effect on human beings in society of what happens with GPS. And I was kind of interested in what you think would happen when it's sort of ubiquitous, when it's like everything. So when you ask, when you sort of ask like, what is a good restaurant? And then it just gives you a conclusion based on information it knows about you or whatever.
Right, and I think we are moving in that direction very, very quickly because suddenly we have information systems, computer systems, that are very good and very quick at analyzing huge amounts of information and pumping out judgments and decisions. Things that we used to think that only people could do, computers are getting better and better at it. But I think the challenge that I tried to talk about, which is realizing that an overdependence on automated decision-making and automated judgment can begin to erode our own ability to perceive and analyze a situation and to make decisions is going to become a more important tension and question in all sorts of areas. And one of the things that's important, particularly when you talk about having a piece of software recommend movies or recommend places to eat or tell you what information you should be looking at or telling you what messages from friends are important, which is something Google and Facebook is already doing through their algorithms. The problem there is that we suffer from what scientists call automation bias, which is we're very quick to have faith in what a computer tells us. So if Google tells you, you do a search on Google and it provides you the top 5 sources, we tend to think those are the best sources because Google told me. And we don't realize that Google's very good at what it does, but it uses a particular view of what's important. Popularity, recency, personalization. And there are other ways to figure out what information is important. You might want information that goes against your own bias, your own belief. You might want diverse points of view. You might want older, better established information than the newer stuff. And so we tend not to even think about alternatives. And similar with Facebook, we kind of take it for granted that it's showing us what's important, not realizing that it has its own motivations and its own incentives. And this is going to become trickier and trickier, I think, to maintain our own autonomy when it becomes ever easier to simply ask the computer where you should go, where you should eat, who you should date, and all of those things that people increasingly go to their computer to ask.
Okay, we have one here and then one in the back.
Yes, I've found that, following GPS into old areas of this country, especially in Europe, where they've taken some of these small towns and cities and closed off city centers. And then you're following your GPS and all of a sudden it's not there anymore. And you get into this like crazy mad, scramble, brings you right back down to earth. And every time you do get a wrong, information, and it happens quite, not regularly, but, And then there's the other issue of, someone who's following the GPS and tends to is a relatively bright person who would get bored at looking at the thing. It's not looking around at the rest of the world, but, but that's one of the things that it's happened to me quite a bit. I use GPS, but, I don't rely on it. The same deal, growing up, in Boston, where you get to use your brain, and you get to, look at people, and see all the phony people, and see all the good people, so you see it all online, get in the club and stuff, that's it.
Yeah. I think what you're pointing out is something I didn't touch on, which is that but we saw it in the example of the Inuit, that if you begin to lose your navigational sense, and then something goes wrong, as it always does, the GPS cuts out or it leads you astray, suddenly you're really lost because you don't have that ability. And so we see all sorts of examples of that these days. Truck drivers now lock into the GPS instructions, and what you see is more examples of trucks plowing into low overpasses, and getting stuck in city streets that they shouldn't be in. These things that you start to tune out and believe everything the computer tells you, and then you find yourself stuck in an underpass or something.
Unfortunately, their companies make them follow those routes.
Yeah.
If they don't, you get in trouble. Anyway.
That's right. Yeah.
There's one in the back there.
Thanks. I think I probably agree with what I take to be the sort of substance of what you've been talking about, but I have two observations to make. One is the GPS systems on the MBTA buses. Once a guy named Chris Dempsey, I think his name is, who's actually now leading the No Boston Olympics effort, once he persuaded other people in management at the T that instead of going after the hackers at MIT who had hacked the Charlie cards to enable them to get in for free, instead of punishing them, to recruit them to free up the data that they had been collecting from the GPS systems, making it possible for talented people to come up with the countdown clock system that was then implemented. That was the reason I wanted to get something like a smartphone so I could tell when the bus was coming. And I've actually met somebody else recently who said that's why they wanted to get one of those more sophisticated phones. So in that one respect, so-called smartphone, in that one respect, I think that it is very useful. But I think I probably agree with you on just about every other application in terms of wayfinding. It's interesting that a well-informed source told me that the MBTA also didn't want to be responsible for doing this because they didn't want to be responsible for the inaccurate information. Now, so there is inaccurate information, but I think one learns quite quickly that it's not always reliable, and especially in certain locations like right around Harvard Yard. The other thing I wanted to say is you said opting out. You talked about opting out. I think it's important to remember that even though iPhones or whatever are pervasive among all incomes, people of all incomes, that there is still a very important dimension to what I still think the term digital divide is still a very useful term, in that as people in government, for example, do everything on email, and people in agencies do everything on email, and they have computers on their desks, and it's very easy for them to communicate, put up a notice about a meeting, sitting at their desk, and never have to put it out where people will see it at a public community bulletin board, for example. So I do think it's not just opting out, but it's people do not have access still in important ways. And that's not exactly wayfinding, but it's participation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with both of those points, that there are many, basic government services now that are actually very hard to do without a computer, and there are still plenty of people who don't have a computer or don't have a good internet connection or whatever. And it's very easy to lose sight of that fact when you yourself are surrounded by the information all the time. And I think there are all sorts of ways to go to the other example of knowing how long it will be before a train or a bus comes along. I have found that a valuable a valuable service, and so I think there are plenty of ways where new information can be brought to us that's very useful. I also find that when the information is wrong and it says, you know, train's going to be there in 2 minutes and turns out to be 3 minutes, that turns out to be the longest minute ever.
I have a very flexible definition. Sir, was there a question back here?
Oh, just a comment. When you were talking about Google has its own biases, not only does it have its own biases that were the biases of the people that created it, but it also has bugs. So even if you agree with their biases, you might not be getting what you want.
There was a interesting example that happened, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, when Google rolled out a new algorithm for Gmail, a new auto-suggest algorithm. I don't know if you saw anything about this. You know, the thing that when you start typing somebody's name in the address field, the to field, it fills it in for you. And they messed it up. So instead of, you know, recommending the obvious choice, it would recommend some obscure person that, and people all of a sudden were sending out emails to the wrong person, which is a good example, a kind of simple example of how easy it is to build this kind of trust in the computer, so much so that, you know, you'll send an email that you meant to go to your best friend, to your mother instead, because even though you're typing in that field, you don't even see it, you just trust the computer. So yeah.
Let's see, one here and then the back. You?
Carr, when you were discussing the equilateral triangles in the brain, the neurological cells, it sort of suggested to me the possibilities of the mind and what's really possible in terms of neuroplasticity. Wondering whether in your research you've looked into what might be taking the place of these navigational systems, whether it's just a total dependence on the screen. I know a lot of people have just remarked how reflexively they look at their phones and things, or whether you can do that.
I don't think we know yet, because you know, this is all happening so quickly that other than, you know, established kind of research that shows, for instance, that London cab drivers, the part of their hippocampus that is involved in making cognitive maps actually literally expands, and expands pretty greatly, because they have to know I mean, London is even stranger than Boston in that sense, and so to understand it, you have to, you know, there are physical changes in the brain that happen. And I think from that we can, you know, anticipate that any kind of navigational learning will have some kind of physical effect in your brain. Your brain will adapt to it, and will, as you get better at it, that leads to anatomical changes in the brain. And if you don't practice it, then you won't get those changes or those benefits. But I think that still is speculation at this point, because I think there just hasn't been time to study what happens. There was an interesting study, and I talk about this in the book, done with mice, again, as most of them are, that they had mice go through a physical maze, and then they had mice go through a virtual maze that was exactly the same. And what they found is that the many fewer place cells and grid cells were activated when the mouse went through the virtual maze, which shows you, again, that there's all kinds of sensory cues, tactile, smell, light, and stuff that we're constantly aware of in processing, but we don't, because it's done kind of unconsciously and behind the scenes, we don't place importance on that. And so we think, oh, just virtualize it and it'll be the same. Well, it's not the same, because you don't have those rich sensory impressions coming to you.
I had an insight through the course of the discussion here. Maybe I should provide this by way of analogy. So I know when something's lost in my house, I ask my wife where it is, because she has the method that is, where is this thing? You know, so where are the possible locations for it? And so in the context of information systems, I think about information systems as not being like some thing that you're beholden to, but instead farming out expertise. Okay? And so so GPS is good for farming out certain pieces of expertise, but also we might rely on a guide if we're navigating down a river.
Right.
And it's completely acceptable in that context to allow ourselves to be beholden to the expertise of that guide. So I maybe this is just by way of comment about so how can we take analogies from that sort of offloading expertise to human operators and make insights for that about how it's the appropriate way to maybe offload expertise to information systems.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. In psychologists and neuroscientists have the phrase transactional memory to describe when you borrow somebody else's memory, in effect. It might be a real person next door knows gardening, so you go to ask that person what plant this is in your near your house. You transact memory rather than have it in your own brain, or it can be from a book or a YouTube video or anything. And I think, thank goodness we can use transactional memory, that we're not locked into just what we know. On the other hand, I do think you can go too far. The process of consolidating your own memory, of learning things yourself, is really the basis for personal knowledge. And you not only learn the thing, but you connect it with everything else you know. So even though transactional memory, asking somebody else or whatever, is often absolutely essential, I think it's the first step in knowledge building. And if we become too dependent on outside sources, external sources, then I think we begin to emaciate our own memory, and I think that means also reducing our own knowledge and know-how.
My question builds on the previous one in a way. I wonder if you see any parallel that goes beyond a mere analogy between reliance on GPS to find our way in the world and reliance on mechanical translation to find our way linguistically in the world. I studied languages when I was an undergraduate and enjoyed the challenge of translating into a foreign language and speaking a foreign language. And on occasions when I tried using, say, Google Translate for languages that I don't speak, and then have someone look at who doesn't know the language, look at what's going out, they're always either amused or just distressed. The fluidity of that. And when I try it with a language I do know, I have the same feeling. It seems to me that maybe that's an analogy, even though quite a direct parallel of what's happening when we use GPS. That's sort of a lack of richness, texture, context, and understanding and sensitivity to the environment, in this case, the linguistic environment, that really touches upon something that's very human and that makes us who we are in terms of our ability.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting analogy because for the same reason that often, even if you know that the translation isn't very good, you still say, well, I kind of know, it's kind of telling me what it says, and since I don't have an expert in that language around, it's useful enough. But that again can lead to starting to discount the value of subtlety and nuance and precision, and beginning to say, well, good enough is good enough all the time or most of the time, and you begin to devalue the actual translator, the human translator skills, because you say, well, this is good enough, so don't hire the real translator. And so as a society, we begin to demean expertise, and as a result begin to lose it, and think that, oh, it's okay because it's close enough.
It's time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay. So there's this famous Silver Spring, Maryland case where the 2 kids have not been allowed to go to the neighborhood park and to go to the neighborhood library because the police picked them up. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Okay, so it's associated with the free-range kids movement.
Oh, yeah.
But it's been constantly in the news around Washington, D.C. So the related example is Obama proposed free access to national parks for grade 4. I don't know how they can get to the national parks, but anyway. Yeah. So if we look at the justification for that 9-year-olds need to experience nature and finding their way, but they're not allowed to. Essentially, they're not allowed to in rich countries anyway. Then doesn't that take us to the sacrilegious extreme where we're going to have to restore 9-year-olds' ability to find their way through the world, who have not implanted, but they have de facto devices attached to them. And we're going to have to admit as a society that, whether it's the Boy Scouts Association or the Chinese government, we know exactly where they are. So can we liberate them to a little bit, not get their way all the way to the national parks, but admit that it's going to be a new kind of wayfinding, that we have to a Big Brother kind of wayfinding
Yeah.
that we have to tolerate?
Well, I hope not, but unfortunately, you sound fairly rational. And I mean, I can totally see that if you take away from kids through technology and through social restrictions or whatever, the ability to go out and figure out the world and develop these things, then you might have to replace them with some kind of artificial thing. All I can say is I hope that doesn't happen, but I can certainly see the scenario you're pointing out. I'm reading Dave Eggers' novel The Circle, which is about a dystopian near future world that's run by a Google-y type company called The Circle, and they're developing a way to implant GPS receivers in babies' bones, so parents can keep track of them and people can keep track of them all the time. So, to me, it is a dystopian scenario, but I can see how it could play out.
Verizon makes a lot of money from its $5 a month child filters. It's only, I think, the upper classes at the moment, but it seems like it's coming.
Hi, yeah. So from what I'm understanding of everything that you said so far, it kind of seems as if you're coming from a position where like humans have a great amount of knowledge and like we're kind of like losing that knowledge over time. Whereas I was actually thinking that it could be interpreted, or GPS, the system of GPS could be interpreted from a different direction, where the people who previously like didn't really like have a good like spatial knowledge could actually, because of this GPS, go out and explore more and like be perfectly secure in like where they are, or like knowing like that they can get back to like where they were originally. So like kind of like this idea of like, I guess like a democratization of like information. So I was wondering, could you comment on like maybe like the balance between like the loss of like this wayfinding ability versus like this like increase in like the number of people who actually go out and are able to experience wayfinding?
Well, I have pretty poor navigational sense. But from the research I've done and what I've learned, I actually am now kind of try to minimize my use of navigational tools, because that little bit of sense I want to have, I don't want to sacrifice. So I don't think I don't think it's necessarily the case that because you're not naturally good at something, you shouldn't try to at least maximize your own expertise. Having said that, I think you point out a fundamental tension about automation, particularly as it's playing out today, which is that in many cases, automating anything, including GPS, opens an activity up to more people, because you don't have to learn the stuff. You don't have to learn how to use a map or a compass if you go out exploring. And as long as the GPS system keeps working and the battery remains charged, you're fine. If it doesn't, then you're in really big trouble, and that happens. But I do think that there is this tension between using automation to open up an activity to people who aren't experts and demeaning expertise in that area. And I think we see this in photography. I think we see it in all sorts of areas. And how we navigate that tension is going to be very important to the quality, I think, of society in the emphasis we place on deep expertise. So I agree that you shouldn't have to be an expert in everything to do something. On the other hand, we should be very, very careful about automating things to the extent that people come to believe that developing our own skills and our own talents is somehow not important, because artificial expertise is never going to be as rich as real expertise. But how that plays out in any individual's life is really up to them.
So, thank you very much.